Hello and welcome. We are in Sao Paulo for Brasil Investment Forum, and I'm now joined here by Helio Magalhaes, the CEO of Citi in Brazil. So thank you so much for being with me. I wanted to ask you about long-term financing. So Citi has a presence, obviously, in the country, which focuses on institutional clients. There are plenty of opportunities in the market. But it's quite a challenge to attract institutional investors to these long-term projects. Why so?
Well, first of all, I think there are many opportunities in terms of long-term projects in Brazil. That's the number one. I think very few countries present such number of opportunities like we have in Brazil. Yes, there are some challenges in terms of some risks that need to be addressed on a project of that long. I think most of the issues, I think the government, through the new rules, are addressing. And there is always the question of who's going to finance, a long-term project. As you know, Basel imposed a limitation for banks to work with long-term financing. And the reason is it costs much more capital, and the return it's penalized. So what we see today in Brazil, it's a discussion around banks being financing the project, the beginning, and then during the life of the concession or the life of the business, we would attract the long-term investors. That they don't have the limitation in terms of capital, and they are looking for long-term projects in terms of their investments. And then the question is, will Brazil be able to attract those investors? My answer is yes. We at Citi, we have relationship with many of those investors through our markets business. We have a chance to talk to them outside. I just came from a series of conversations with some of them, and I can tell you that, first of all, Brazil is in their list. Second, they are very close trying to understand, those opportunities, making their own assessment of those projects, and most of them, at least the ones that I spoke with, they are very interested. Because Brazil can represent for them an opportunity to have good returns on the long term.
So, but there are still quite a lot of risks, of course, not least political risk, and I think this is what a lot of international investors are trying to get their hands around. How can a structure try to mitigate this risk, and when do you think political risk will eventually dive down?
Okay, two things. First of all, let me talk about what are basic conditions for investors. The first one, transparency. I think they need to have information. They need to know everything about the project, the service, the concession. So transparency is one thing. The second thing is a legal framework that can guarantee that the rules that the business case will be built. It will be the rules for the entire life of the investment, right? So those are the two most important things for one investor. Of course, the political instability, it's not something that investors like, because the whole thing about is what are the risks I run against the price I pay against the returns I have. I think political instability normally have impact in the economy, What we saw in Brazil in the last, let's say, year and a half was a big change in terms of political environment. We faced an impeachment of a president last year. We had a new government that started in May, became the real president and the real government in August. And since then, the government worked on bringing stability for the economy. Which was needed. In fact, Brazil is running on a very large deficit, and we know that long-term for a country, an economy like Brazil, you cannot live like that. The debt is just going up. So,
of course, but if I may interrupt, of course now the political scandal that's led also to the impeachment of the previous president, Dilma Rousseff, has now found its way onto the current president. So although the message from last year, particularly when we had the opening of the forum, on stage we had the president, we had plenty of ministers at the head of the Senate and the president of the House of Representatives, that the message was reforms will go ahead. But I'm sure that it's international investors might be still quite concerned.
Well, no, definitely. I think on the short term should be. We are, right? So if you look at how the market, the local markets, is seeing the situation. We didn't see volatility. We saw, of course, on the first days, I think the government acted well, Treasury and central bank, they act with the tools they have. So we have a kind of a stable situation today from the market's perspective. I think this tells us that the market is expecting that no big change will happen. In other words, that the political crisis will be solved in some way, and the direction that the economy was facing will be maintained. In other words, that the reforms will be approved. I think the market saw the plan that was put in place by this government to address the deficit through the reforms, which are needed for Brazil for a long, long time. This is the right direction. If you look at from the market is pricing today as if this direction will not change. The political crisis will need to be solved, and it's going to be hopefully short term. I think the worst case scenario is that we don't solve the political crisis, we stay in kind of limbo, and then this will impact certainly the economy, and of course will make the investment more concerned. What we see here in Brazil is it's not that case. It's the case where the solution will come on a short period of time, and we're going to see the reforms making progress. Of course, we're going to waste 1, 2, or 3 months, but directionally we wouldn't see any big change.
Okay, so we'll remain positive, at least from your perspective, about Brazil's ability to attract investments to the country.
I think it's not me only, but I think if you talk to business people, if you talk to the markets, you're going to see the same answer. And again, the time is playing against us. The longer we stay with the crisis, I think the worse it will be for the economy and of course, as a consequence, for the long-term investment. But we don't think that's going to happen.
Thank you so much for your comments, Helio.
My pleasure.